right, we're going to take a 5-minute break. All right, we're going to call to order the Assembly Committee of the Whole work session for September 6th. We're still in the Juanita Helms Administrative Center, more specifically the Mona Lisa Drexler Assembly Chambers. Madam Clerk, could we have a roll call?
Yes, I'd like to note for the record that Ms. Major, Mr. Quist, and Mr. Gray are excused. Mr. Lejeski.
Here.
Mr. Tackey.
Here.
Mr. Roberts.
Here.
Mr. Cooper.
Here.
Ms. Dodge. Here. Mr. Lawrence.
Here.
You have a quorum.
All right, thank you. We have no memoranda reports or presentations, thank God. So we're moving on to advance ordinances and resolutions. Ordinance number 2018-26, an ordinance amending Chapter 21.28 of the Fairbanks North Scarborough Code to add definitions and standards for retrofit controlled devices, including electrostatic precipitators. The sponsors are Mayor Castle and Assembly members Roberts, Cooper, and Lawrence. Mayor, may we have a staff report? And there is additional information in the green folders. Mayor?
Thank you. Yes, we can have a staff report. Thank the powers that be. Mr. Zarnicki is still here and ready to roll.
Thank you. So this is the staff report on Ordinance 2018-26. And first off, to jump into this, back in February we had another ordinance that dealt with ESPs and gasification. That was Ordinance 2017-63. And that particular ordinance failed to pass, which led us to doing all of the coordination and work to put together this ordinance. I wanted to highlight some of the differences between the previous ordinance and the one that you guys have in front of you right now. First off, the gasification units was removed from the ordinance for being exempted appliances. And it also expanded ESPs to include any retrofit control device, so that included catalysts. That was an important bullet point so that we could ensure that this was open to the broadest category and not just a single manufacturer. Ordinance 2018-26 sets a tested certification threshold for the retrofit control devices at 0.0028 pounds per million BTU. I would like to note for the record that I had misspoke during the APCC conference and had 3 zeros behind that decimal point. Oh, that's what is in the APCC recommendation. I went back and double and triple checked our numbers. The correct number has 2 zeros, and so the ordinance is correct as written. That number is based on the emission rating of a oil-fired boiler, and it does include the device efficiencies, so that's how efficiently it transfers the heat from the combustion box to the room, which is what you're actually after there.
Excuse me.
Yeah, Mr. Roberts.
Yeah, on that point, are we talking both based on doing something hydronically, or are we talking with a standard wood pellet stove, just putting heat out of the unit and it's spreading through the air?
Yeah, so it's the device efficiency. When you combust a fuel, you release a certain amount of energy, and that energy is quantified in BTUs. And then the amount of energy that's actually transferred into space heating is less than what's actually combusted in the fuel. And so the device efficiency is the net of how much actually gets transferred to the room. So it's how much useful heat comes out of the device. And so wood stoves have a lower device efficiency than say a natural gas fired boiler, which is a very efficient device, especially the new ones that have the triple pass heat exchangers and condensing boilers.
So you're saying that's regardless of whether it's heating air or heating liquid, the efficiency is independent of that factor?
Off the top of my head, I don't know the answer to that. I don't think it's independent of that factor. I think it includes that factor in the device efficiencies.
So if somebody had a solid fuel device that took advantage of a home's normal hydronic heating system, then they would have a higher efficiency in the way you're measuring it here?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I'd have to go back into the spreadsheets and look at the device efficiencies and how they're calculated.
All right. I would be curious to know that answer. If you can get
Right.
something to me later.
Yeah, we can. I can provide you a breakout of those device efficiencies.
Great, thanks.
And so the ordinance that's in front of you, what it does is it has the exemption for retrofit control devices. That's the whole basis of the ordinance, is to provide an exemption to the curtailment program. And for the exemption to apply, we broke out solid fuel burning appliances into 3 categories: the pellet stoves, catalytically controlled wood stoves, and non-catalytically controlled wood stoves. And those 3 categories were decided upon because that's made logical sense to break the testing out into those broad categories. And again, this was based on a lot of the coordinated efforts with EPA to determine the testing protocol, and we were trying to limit the amount of testing that was required to get these passed. And so we couldn't just get one device and have it apply across all solid fuel burning appliances because they have different combustion characteristics. So those are the device categories that we ended up with for the testing protocol. And the ordinance requires testing for each RCD category combination to meet the threshold. So what the ordinance does is it allows, if you have a pellet stove, you could have an ESP, you could have a catalyst, you could have any number of retrofit control devices, and all of those retrofit control devices, they could be tested with the pellet stove and approved, and if they met the threshold and they were approved, then the exemptions would apply. And likewise, each different type of retrofit control device has to be tested across each category. So an ESP, for example, that meets the pellet, it would only apply for the pellet unless it actually met the catalytically controlled wood stove device as well. So it's a matrix of devices and different control options.
Excuse me, Ms. Dodge.
No, you're going to get to it. It's the next bullet. Thank you.
And so once a device is past that, then the ordinance provides an exemption for both stage 1 and stage 2 curtailment, and then it implements a new curtailment stage that sets in at 55 micrograms per meter cubed. For your reference, stage 1 is set at 25 micrograms and stage 2 is set at 35 micrograms. And so this would allow those devices to operate up until you hit 55 micrograms, and that number was based on what's put in the moderate SIP, and so that's the highest we can go to avoid backsliding. So the implications of this ordinance, with the magnitude of the serious non-attainment area, it's revealed that we need emission reductions of about 80% to reach attainment. That's a very rough number, but that just gives you an idea of the magnitude of the problem that we're facing. And I want to note that any rule relaxation, not only will we have the backsliding implications, but it also erases those hard-earned gains that we've already made. And eventually, the way that the regulations are is we're just going to have to make those up elsewhere. And so, you know, it's not just backsliding. We don't want to erase any of the forward progress that has already been made on this issue. And so any additional exemptions from the curtailment program, those add emissions during the periods that we've identified are the times where we have the highest pollutant concentrations. And so we want to really evaluate any exemptions to the curtailment program carefully. And for an example of what those exemptions are, that's the exemption in this ordinance is a retrofit exemption. Another example would be if we relaxed the no ash requirements, because the no ash is an exemption to the curtailment program. So anytime we're looking at those exemptions, those have to be done very carefully to ensure that we don't go backwards. And the proposed ordinance allows exemptions from the curtailment program, and the threshold and testing requirements that we have worked out in this ordinance, they will definitely mitigate some of the potential for emission increases because we set that threshold so low. A couple of the items that are not all figured out within this ordinance are how to deal with long-term performance and durability. That's going to require some additional work, and unfortunately we just aren't quite there yet. We really need to see results of testing, how the testing works with the Testo handheld units, and then define some sort of community testing program where we can test these in the field and determine monitoring thresholds would be the way that we can address those issues. So what we have does mitigate the potential, but it's not all the way there for ensuring that there's no emission increases. And that's what this slide talks about, is the long-term performance and durability, that we're still just not there. This has not been implemented in the United States, and so we're forging new ground. It's been implemented in Europe and in other areas, and you know, the device works. There's no doubt about that. It's how well does it work, and how do we fit that into our regulatory framework, because the reality is the regulatory framework in Europe is quite different than what we have in the United States, and they have a lot more inspection and you know, authority to go shut down devices than we have in the United States, and so that's why these devices can work so well over there. And so this is a repeat of some of the information. It's our professional opinion that no known retrofit device can meet the threshold that we have presented here. And it's our opinion that given where we're at with the issue, that we need 80% emission reductions, that there could be better ways to spend local resources. And these should be taken more of as advantages and disadvantages, because in a perfect world, if we had unlimited money, this would be a fantastic opportunity to pursue. But the reality of the situation is we don't have limited resources. We have a very serious air quality problem, and we have to choose where we want to spend our resources and what's the best way to ultimately reach attainment for the community. And again, I want to reiterate the point that regardless of whether or not a device actually meets the threshold, the test results will still absolutely be useful. So this money, you know, even if the testing fails, it would still be quite useful for the air quality division. And that's really the staff report that I had, but I also wanted to share with the Assembly a presentation, and I'll do the as fast and abbreviated version as I can, that we made for the stakeholders group back in July. Or this one was in August, and this is what I briefly talked about before. What the stakeholders group has done is they have gone through a very large list of control measures, and through their debate and discussion, they have come up with their top 14 list of control measures for consideration. It's by no means their recommendation or anything yet, it's just those that rose to the top. And we wanted to quantify the emission reductions from those to give them an idea of what the order of magnitude is. And so I'm going to breeze through this stuff really quickly and go back to the chart, but I did want to talk that these control measures, we lumped them into some very broad categories that you can see there. And there are some very severe limitations to this analysis. It required numerous assumptions. The analysis represents the upper bound of emission reductions possible. So all assumptions were that we're going to get the greatest number of emission reductions. They were biased high. This does not take into account emission inventory versus actual. So the emission inventory is the way that we estimate emissions. Actual emissions are always different. It doesn't take into account that, and it does not take into account overlap, which is probably one of the most important things. Overlap is double counting of emission reductions. I have a couple of examples here. I'll just go over one. If we have a new construction permit requirement, which the borough has in place, there's a proposed measure out there to ban new installation of hydronic heaters. Both of those control measures would prohibit new installations of uncertified hydronic heaters. However, we can only count that reduction once. What this analysis does is it just shows you the entire blue and it shows you the entire purple. It doesn't take into account any overlap. And why that is important is when I put this in context, this chart, what we have here are the 2013 baseline winter season non-attainment emission inventory. And so if you look at the 2.62 number, I left my pointer over there, but if you look at the PM 2.5 and for all sources space heating, you'll see that the tons per day is 2.62 tons per day. That number is what we need to reduce by approximately 80%. So that gives you some sort of benchmark of the magnitude of emission reductions that are required. Now, when we go back to this chart, what you can see is you can see that curtailment at 50% compliance rate gives us quite a bit of that emission reduction chunk. And you can see that retrofit control devices gives us 0.62 tons per day. What the overlap means is that these are not, you can't just sum these together. You can't take curtailment at 50% compliance, dry wood, and retrofit control devices and say we're there.
Ms. Dodge.
Can you tell us what our goal is on this sheet? I mean, do we have a goal that we need to attain?
Yeah, the goal is we need 80% emission reductions, so we need 80% reductions of that 2.62 number right there.
Okay.
And so math, if you can
go
do
back to-
80% of 2.62. And so that's the goal that you want to reach. And what I'm saying is that because we haven't accounted for overlap, you can't just add these together. We're working on that analysis.
But also that the sulfur would accomplish it. Low sulfur diesel, according to that, sulfur,
Well,
or
not-
sulfur reduction.
The sulfur reduction I'll get to in a second. That one is, so basically, this is meant as a comparison from all the blue, for all the blue bars in the chart. So you can compare what
Yes.
emission reductions are available through curtailment versus removal of solid fuel burning appliances versus wide-scale implementation of a retrofit control device. That's what this can do. Now, the green bar with the sulfur reductions, that number, when we go back to this chart, because these are done by pollutant, you have to compare that green number to 3.62, which is the SO2 space heating number.
Okay.
So under SO2. And the sulfur emission reductions, what that estimates right there is the mandate of ultra-low sulfur diesel for all heating appliances. And coupled with that sulfur decrease that you see, also comes a 0.03 increase in PM 2.5 emissions, and that's due to the cross-price elasticity that the increase in fuel prices for going to ULSD will drive a certain number of people to use more wood. And so that is the economists at UAF and DEC worked on that analysis to come up with that cross-price elasticity, and that's built into this chart that we're showing here.
Are you done?
Wait, the
Mr.
negative cross
Wojcicki, go ahead.
price elasticity, that's the minus 0.03?
Correct, because this is an emission reduction chart. A negative number results in an increase.
Right, so basically you're saying some people won't be able to afford or choose not to spend money on ultra-low sulfur diesel, so they'll burn wood as an alternative, and that wood will emit an additional 0.03 tons per day.
Somewhat. What it is the higher price of fuel, because with a ULSD mandate, there won't be a choice to use ULSD. That will be all that's available in the community. With that comes a higher price of fuel oil. The difference between what they pay now versus the higher price will naturally cause some people to shift to other sources to heat their home, which includes wood. And so we're trying to analyze and figure out what that effect will be.
Right, so I don't know, I'm just looking at, I was just shocked that the number was so small. I would have expected it would have been more substantial than 0.03 minus.
Well, and this was done with a cross-price elasticity of 0.2, and that number is still in question, so this analysis is going to be continuously updated as we get better information.
All right, a couple of questions from me. This chart we're looking at, removal of solid fuel burning appliances, is that all of them in the borough? And if so, why such a small reduction in PM 2.5 if they're the majority of the cause?
Yep, no, that's not, that is not all of them, and this goes into, I believe there's like 8 pages of assumptions that are down here in the, down at the end. And the removal of solid fuel burning appliances, you can read through the assumptions, but basically that's a date certain removal of uncertified devices. So that does not cover all of the solid fuel burning appliances. That's just one of the control measures that we have to evaluate. And that would say by a certain date, you know, pick one, say 2020, 21, somewhere in there, that all uncertified devices would be removed. And I believe that we used assumed a ceiling for the compliance rate with that particular control measure of 50%. But I'll have to look through there to make sure that's correct.
And one other question, with regards to this sulfur dioxide, reduction. I'm trying to make sure I understand why that's in there. I know there's a connection between sulfur dioxide and PM 2.5, but isn't it fair to say that the big problem this community has is PM 2.5 and not sulfur?
Correct. As we've stated many times, that residential wood smoke is the largest contribution to PM 2.5. However, with the regulations in the serious SIP, the sulfur contribution, while it's not the largest contribution, it still represents somewhere between 9 and 14% of the PM 2.5. Because it's significant enough, it cannot be dismissed from the analysis with a precursor demonstration. And so what that means is that we have to look at SO2 controls along with PM 2.5 controls. And that's a requirement in the federal rule, and it's a requirement of the law. And that's why the power plants have to look at additional SO2 controls, and that's why the community has to look at a ULSD mandate.
In your dealings with EPA, I believe, my understanding is they recognize the economic impact of increasing fuel oil prices by reducing sulfur, that will tend to get people to burn more wood, right?
That is correct, and that's the number that we're trying to figure out. That's what that negative 0.03 there represents, and as I stated before, that number is It's being evaluated right now, and this will be updated as we get new information.
All right, and I guess finally, if sulfur, from my perspective, I don't see, unless we just, shut down solid fuel burning appliances, even requiring the point sources to address SO2, which increases our utility prices, could have a negative effect in total on our PM 2.5, right?
Yeah, that's correct, and that's that's the whole point of the stakeholders group, is to get. I mean, you're touching on the fact that this issue is not just about wood burning devices. That this encompasses all of the power plants, which are the point sources. It encompasses everybody that burns number 2 fuel oil. It's the wood burning devices, and the point of the stakeholders group is to get all of those people together in the same room and to go over these issues, give everybody the most information they possibly can, so that the community members and all of the affected people in the community can come up with a recommended control package that the community can live with. It's not going to be easy, but that's what the stakeholders group is doing, is considering all these, and they're going to come up with a recommended package and get that delivered to decision makers such as this body for recommendations. And I guess I knew that this was going to dive into a discussion that's a little bit off topic, and so just to steer back to the ordinance that's at hand, the important piece is to look at of this chart is to look at the curtailment program, because that is the program, the control measure that this ordinance is proposing an exemption to. That's one of the best near-term control measures that we have in our toolbox in order to solve this problem. And so I just wanted to get that point across, that if we're doing any exemptions for this program, that they need to be vetted and looked at very carefully to ensure that we can still actually solve this problem. Because if we take away that tool, we don't have that many other tools that are going to be useful to solve this problem. And I also wanted to present this so that you could look at the retrofit control devices and see that number, that 0.62 number there, is based on a wide-scale implementation across all devices in the non-attainment area, excluding outdoor hydronic heaters, fireplaces, and coal boilers, but including everything else, including certified devices and uncertified devices. It assumes a 60% control efficiency on certified devices and a 40% control efficiency on uncertified devices. So if we have a huge wide-scale implementation of these retrofit control devices, it does help. I mean, you can see by the 0.62 that it helps almost as much as a date-certain removal of uncertified devices. And so I wanted everybody to know that there are additional uses out there in addition to what's being put forward in this ordinance as an exemption to the curtailment program, and I wanted you to understand how important the curtailment program is.
All right, thank you. Proceed.
And basically, after this chart, this next slide going through the benefits of future year restrictions, very briefly, if you see on the first one, the future year restrictions is very low at 0.01. This is things like permits and things like that restrict future installations. It's very low in 2019 because there's nothing really to actually affect any emission reductions, but those grow over time. So they're also a very important element to add into any control measure package. And then the last pages on there, I'm not going to run through these right now, but you're free to read them. This has been delivered to the stakeholder group. It's available online. But that's all the assumptions that went into making that bar chart there to try to give you an idea of the magnitude of the problem and what some of the solutions are.
All right, does that include your part of the presentation?
That concludes my part of the presentation.
All right, we've got 2 other sponsors, or 3 other. Mr. Roberts?
So this came about because of the big conversation we had when the last ESP ordinance was brought up about backsliding, and what we found out that backsliding is really it's really only applicable to stuff that's already been put in the SIP. And it turns out our last ordinance isn't in a SIP yet because it's still a draft SIP. So the last ordinance that's in an official EPA-approved SIP is the 2015 ordinance. So that's why we figured we could jump in before this SIP gets approved and try to get some rules set up so that we can use ESPs once we get some of that testing done that the Assembly members kind of wanted when we were looking at the last ordinance. So this is an effort to get moving, to get ESPs and similar devices in our code. And then we'll do some testing and maybe we'll get some stuff going. I mean, ultimately, what's going to really work with these ESPs is when the EPA gets behind them and then gives us the blessing to really change things. Because this isn't going to get us very far, but at least gives us some hope and it gets us moving in a good direction. I think they just have, there's just so much impact those devices will have if put out there in mass. And hopefully we'll see that, that the EPA will eventually catch on. But this here is to get it into our code before the SIP passes so that the state can put that in the SIP. Remember that every single BACM, best available control measure, started somewhere. Some community started it. And so every single measure we're looking at, so we can start something. Now this by itself isn't a BACM, it's an exemption, but it can lead to some BACMs and it can affect them, and it can be something that can end up being used around the country. And so that's all I have to say on it.
All right, Mr. Cooper.
I think Mr. Sarnecki and Mr. Roberts covered it well. I will note that in the additional materials, there is a memorandum from the Air Pollution Control Commission supporting the draft ordinance. So I'll direct your attention to that. I think it's in the green folder with one recommendation to consider and one that Mr. Zarnecki's cleared up for us, so we'll take that into account next week. I do want to acknowledge the tremendous amount of work that Mr. Zarnecki's put into this with DEC and EPA. I know that he really went above and beyond in working with the agencies to find a path forward, so I appreciate that. I think the rest of the things I have to say are better served next week, so that's all.
All right, thank you. Okay, I don't have anything to add at this point. All right, let's open it up for questions. Oh, Ms. Dodge. Yeah.
I just want to clarify, it appears to me that on line 109, where we talk about no ash, that there are no proposed changes to no ash, they're just other than renumbering. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
That's correct, yep.
All right, further questions? Ms. Dodge.
So basically what we're doing here is adding a definition of what an RCD is and setting these RCD stages. Is that correct? Thank you.
All right, quick question. On line 167, you've got the 0.0028 pounds per million BTU, or whatever that unit of measure is. That's the correct number, is that correct? Or is that off?
That is the correct number.
So the Air Pollution Control Commission is confused, or,
Actually, I was confused when I was presenting to the Air Pollution Control Commission.
I see, okay. All righty. Yeah, don't ever let that happen again. All right, Mr. Lejeski.
All right, so I just wanted to have it said again. What are the projections if we eliminate how many tons of PM 2.5 per day in the winter that we get to compliance? Was that, did you say that was 2.5 or 3?
Yeah, so, well, there's a couple of things with the projections. Just to give everybody a rough benchmark of where we need to be, we need roughly an 80% emission reduction from that chart where I presented the 2013 emission inventory data. And then there's the model that I discussed. I can bring those PowerPoint presentations back up.
Okay, so on your chart, I'm rounding the point source. Actually, it looks like it's about 4 tons per day is what you had in 2013 winter baseline.
The number that you should be looking there is under the PM 2.5 column, and it's area sources, space heating all, and it's 2.62 tons per day, because we need, wide range emission reductions across all sources, but specifically because of the regulatory requirements, we're looking at space heating sources. So to simplify things, instead of trying to digest every single number in this chart, the easiest way to boil it down is we need 80% reduction of that 2.62 number.
So we don't need 80% of the point source plus the area source plus the on-road mobile sources, which would be about 80% of 4. We just need 80% of 2.62.
Well, actually, we need roughly an 80% reduction of all of the PM 2.5 emission sources. But what that doesn't take into account is the dispersion of the point sources and the fact that most of them emit above the emission layer. And so the contribution of every source to the monitor is actually different. And that's what the model takes into account. The 80% is an oversimplification just to give you a benchmark of where you need to be. You can't take that number and apply it and say, this is exactly what we need to be, this is our goal, let's go there. It's meant to be an indicator is all it is, just an oversimplification of the process. Does that make sense?
Well, what I'm hearing is 80% reduction of 2.62 is modeled to approximately get us close to compliance.
Yeah.
And you're saying like this 1.25 isn't that significant because it's hot, it goes up to the stacks, and it largely, there's a large portion of it that basically blows out. We don't breathe it. It's not at the sensor level. It's not at our lung level.
No, it's still significant, but the contribution to the actual monitors and what we breathe is different than the 2.62. It's not the same. It still matters. All of these numbers we have, well, the ones that we're actually looking at are the PM 2.5 and the SO2 numbers. And so they all matter. The difference is that we're looking at emission inventories and we're trying to simplify the problem right now just for discussion purposes. And it doesn't take into account some of the complexities in the actual dispersion of these pollutants and how they impact the monitors.
Yeah, we're assuming everything's a uniform bowl of air shed, whatever.
Pretty much, yeah.
I got one more, if the chair's going to let me.
Go for it.
So this doesn't make sense to me on the chart. Curtailment, 50%, 1.14, which should be, for one, that I would think that would be roughly 50% of the area space heat wood, which is 2.46. So it seems like it should be a little higher, like 2.23, or sorry, 1.23. I don't know, it's close, but it seems like it's less than 50%. So I don't know why it is, if we're assuming that the smaller burners agree to curtail and it's the bigger burners who don't.
Yeah, I'll look into the specifics on the emission inventory, but that calculation is, yeah, basically based on 80% of the compliance rate, or sorry, not 80%, I have too many numbers floating around my head, 50% of the compliance rate. But I can look into the specifics as to why that differs.
And then the other one that doesn't make sense to me is, I mean, that one mostly makes sense, the 50%, right? It's close. But the retrofit control devices, which is basically ESPs, implementation of them, I think you said on a wide scale, or a wide, basically 100% adoption.
Correct.
On all the time. I'm confused about the assumptions behind that, because if they were working at 50% efficiency, I would think that would be a 1.31 reduction instead of a 0.62. So it looks like you're assuming that they work 25%-ish efficiency.
Oh, well, actually, you have to take into account that we assumed that they were installed on every device except for hydronic heaters, fireplaces, and coal-fired devices, because they're devices that we know about are not applicable for installation on those certain devices. So there's a population of solid fuel burning appliances that they didn't get installed on. Then we, based on the data that we've seen, we assumed a device efficiency, so the removal efficiency of 60% for EPA certified devices and 40% for non-EPA certified devices.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, you said that earlier. It just didn't compute before. I got it now. So
Yeah,
thank you.
no, there's a lot of assumptions and numbers in this stuff. It's
All right, further questions? I've got one. It's, and staff's recommendation is that there, this ordinance, or the testing of these RCDs are going to cost the borough almost $500,000. And the administration or the staff points out that there may be other uses of that money that will be more productive as far as reducing PM 2.5 emissions. And so you're saying instead of focusing on an exemption that, may allow people to keep burning wood, what's your alternative? I mean, give me an example of what could be done with that money instead that could be more useful.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So an example of what could be done that would be more useful from an air quality perspective is to require a retrofit control device for all no-ash residences. What that would do is that would target specifically those folks that are burning during the times that we have the worst pollution, and it would control the emissions from those devices. We could use that money to fund installation of those and actually get some very near-term emission reductions during our highest pollution days. Now that's, again, strictly from an air quality perspective, and that doesn't take into account all the other factors that you have to consider, but that's one example.
Well, what about EPA? I mean, don't we have to go through testing before EPA would sign off on anything like that?
No, the difference is that when right now, because it's written and it's an exemption to the curtailment program, which is, the most effective near-term measure, they want to see that very robust quantification to, have the highest assurances that we're not going to take a step backwards. And so that's the impetus that's driving the testing requirements, is that it's an exemption from a control measure. If we were to try to implement this on no ashes, where there's no chance of an emission increase, the testing wouldn't be required. I will add the caveat that we probably wouldn't be able to claim as many emission reductions in the SIP, but that's the regulatory paperwork exercise. And in reality, we could move forward with a larger scale implementation such as that and see some real emission reductions, and then we could worry about the quantification later, but it certainly wouldn't be required to move forward like that.
All right. Well, I mean, we're getting emails from constituents who are saying, you know, why bother testing? Let's just let all no ash burners, you know, this literally, how much would it cost? How many no ash burners do we have?
Last year, I think we had 135 or 136.
And how much money would it cost to buy an ESP for every one of those?
It's around 2,000 to 2,500 for the ESPs, for a single ESP. So, rough numbers, take 135 times 2,000.
$140,000.
So I guess my question is it the administration's recommendation that that might be a better way to go?
It's staff's recommendation that be a consideration, because, you know, we do recognize that there are other elements, that the intent behind this ordinance was to provide folks with an exemption to the curtailment program. And so we just want to get as much of the information in front of you as possible to be able to make an informed decision.
All right, Mr. Cooper.
I just want to be clear so that we're all on the same page here, that allowing, if this assembly took action to allow folks with a no ash waiver to put an ESP on their device, that would not be considered backsliding. That wouldn't create an issue with DEC or EPA, because I don't know that that was necessarily my understanding before, but it sounds like you're stating pretty clearly right now that that would not be an issue.
Yeah, and it actually wouldn't be allowing those folks to do that, because anybody with a no ash could go out and put one of these in right now. I mean, the folks with no ashes have already demonstrated that they have the need to use their solid fuel burning appliances, so they're already allowed exemptions from the curtailment program. They're already allowed to burn. What I'm suggesting that would result in emission reduction would be for this body to put in a requirement that anybody that has a no ash also has a retrofit control device, whether that's a catalyst or an ESP. That's that's beyond this, but it would be a requirement to install those, and that's where the emission reduction would occur. And under that scenario, there wouldn't be any testing required, because there is no feasible way that you would have an emission increase.
And just to be, not to beat a dead horse, I realize that you're saying there's no testing requirement, but also, to be clear, it wouldn't create any type of violation with DEC or EPA for folks with no ashes to use a retrofit control device.
No, there would be no requirements from DEC or EPA. Having said that, the testing information would still be very useful. You know, if a program like that were implemented, that's where this gets very difficult, because in order to claim, or in order to get credit for those emission reductions in the SIP, we're going to have some way to quantify it, which we still don't have that data. That's why this is such a difficult decision, and you know, why I said that in a perfect world we would absolutely be moving forward with the testing and moving forward on all fronts. But right now at this juncture, you know, it's time to weigh all of the information and try to make the best informed decision with, you know, what's going to be best for the community.
Mr. Lejeski.
So if we paid for and mandated that ESPs be approved or be installed on no ash devices, what's to stop a future SIP? I don't know what they're called when they're revised. Basically, 5 years down the road, we say we don't have the money to install new ones and new no ashes, and we want to repeal that. What's to stop that from being backsliding at that time, some future time?
Well, if it got written into a SIP, then it would be backsliding. You couldn't remove it.
Would the fact, if we went and did that, wouldn't that be noticed and then therefore likely to be added to a future SIP?
Yes, that would be. It would be considered one of the backcom control measures, and it would certainly be added into the SIP.
And then another question, slightly different, is if we did mandate it and we had a certain amount of savings, couldn't we use that savings and reverse offset it to free up additional burning somewhere else to be net neutral in emissions?
Yeah, and that's the whole point behind the stakeholders group, and it's not to reverse something that's existing. See, with the serious SIP, there's a whole slew of potential control measures out there. There's, 80 or 90 some control measures just dealing with residential wood burning that are under consideration. And the retrofit control devices are not one of them because they haven't been implemented anywhere. So if you were to implement a new control measure like that, what it would do is it has the potential to knock something off of that list that's under consideration. So there could be a very onerous control measure out there, like date certain removal of uncertified devices. And there's the potential to say, we don't want to do date certain removal of uncertified devices. We're switching it out with this, mandatory retrofit control device. That possibility is out there, but of course it has to be equal emission reductions, and there's a lot of other nuances to that. But that's the basic idea.
All right, last one.
Yeah. On that chart, if we did 125 no ash stoves on ESPs with 60% efficiency, how big of a magnitude are we talking about it making?
I don't know. Would have to go through those calculations.
No, all right. But the idea of using money of buying ESPs for the no ash burners, the downside of doing that, I mean, there's going to be a reduction, but we don't know how much, and we can't quantify how much of it is because of those 100. Is it 110?
135 or 136.
We won't be able to quantify how much of any improvement we get is based upon that particular program.
Yeah, that's correct. Quantification is difficult. We'll be able to come up with rough numbers to quantify the emission reductions, so something comparable to that chart. But then, of course, equating that to actual impact on the monitors, that's something that we won't be able to connect the dots on.
All right. Other questions? The stakeholders, what status? I mean, their recommendations are going to be for this assembly to consider, correct? Or next?
Correct. Their recommendations will go to this assembly, and they'll also go to the Alaska DEC. They'll be used by this body to recommend what could be considered a suite of backcount control measures, and used by the state to write the state implementation plan.
And these stakeholders are aware of this particular ordinance?
Yes, they are aware of this particular ordinance, and at the next stakeholders meeting on the 14th, we actually have a joint presentation between myself and Jeannie Olson to give them an update on where we stand with ESPs and in particular with this ordinance.
And so this, this quandary or, this choice, and there's other choices, but the choice of whether to spend the money having a testing program on a limited number of ESPs, or using the money to buy 135 ESPs and requiring no ash burners to use it. Has that that decision or that choice been considered by the stakeholders?
No, that piece has not been considered by the stakeholders. And I do just want to point out that the way this ordinance is written, that, the ordinance can be implemented without any funding, and it can sit there and just never be triggered. And you can, try to convince a manufacturer to pay for the testing, which is typically how things are done in industry. And so they are two separate entities, the ordinance and the appropriation that would, speed up the testing requirement to actually see what devices out there would pass it.
So one of the choices of this assembly would be to pass the ordinance we're discussing right now, which will allow for the use of ESPs in the SIP, which, I mean, we would get it into there, but not actually fund the testing until after the stakeholders have put out their recommendations.
Correct, that could be an option.
All right, other questions? Ms. Dodge?
I would just observe that that could also be an incentive for people to buy RCDs, absent this, right? Because it would allow them to take advantage of the RCD stage.
Yeah, but it would, in order for the RCD stage to actually take effect, some sort of RCD appliance combo has to be tested.
Wait, could you, if we pass this ordinance that we're speaking of now, but we don't fund testing, and this might be for Ms. Dolan, you know, what impact does that would that mean that homeowners or you know, property owners who wish to invest in an RCD could do so and therefore burn under stages 1 and 2?
No, not until the testing's done.
Okay, so it is contingent upon testing. All right. Other questions? Okay. We're going to move on. Ordinance number 2018-28, an ordinance rezoning the proposed Goldstream Dream subdivision described as a portion of Government Lot 1, Section 6, Township 1 North, Range 1 West, Fairbanks Meridian, approximately 33.39 acres, from General Use 1 to Rural and Agricultural 5, or other appropriate zone, located north and south of Goldstream Road, north and northeast of Belane Road. The sponsor is Mayor Castle. May we have a, and we do have some materials, I think, in the yellow folder on this, if I recall. Maybe not, but I think we do. Anyway, yeah. Mayor Castle, may we have a staff report?
We can. I'm kind of excited about this because this is a new approach and something we haven't done previously, which I think is a very responsible approach. So as you're aware, the borough has quite a bit of land that we own, and the vast majority is GU1, as our whole borough is. When we go to start selling some of this off, in a lot of cases, GU1 zoning is really not the appropriate zone. And so we've talked about this in-house and decided it makes sense to work with the community to try to determine a better course of zoning for tracts of land that we have and rezone it. We rezone it before we sell or dispose any of it, because after you sell it, rezoning it becomes much more complicated and challenging, and development may not be conducive to what's going on in the neighborhood. And so this is kind of a new approach. I think our planning department has gone above and beyond an effort here working with folks so far to try to explain this, and change is challenging sometimes to explain, but I think that planning has been doing a great job. I attended one of their meetings out in Goldstream when we were kicking this off, and there was quite a bit of apprehension initially on this, and I think they've done a great job in explaining to the people really what this is about. So I'll toss it to Mr. Spillman. Kellen, it's yours. Go for it.
Thank you, Mayor. So as the mayor mentioned, this is a borough-owned property, so it's a little bit confusing, but this is an applicant-initiated rezone, and the applicant in this circumstance is the Borough Division of Land Management, as opposed to an administration-sponsored rezone. So this particular proposal is a small portion of all the lands the borough owns in the Goldstream Valley, approximately 33 acres. And this proposal before you next week is to zone it from general use 1 to rural and agricultural 5. This particular piece of property, it's located directly on Goldstream Road to the east of Belaine Road. And if you're familiar with the intersection of Pandora Drive, it's very near the intersection of Pandora Drive. Right now, this particular property is vacant. It is surrounded mostly by not so dense residential development, more rural type residential development. As you can see from the aerial photo, on 3 sides to the south, the east, and the west are existing residential development. And the land to the north, as well as the land to the northeast, that's all vacant and also owned by the Fairbanks North Star Borough. The zoning out there right now, most of it is general use. That's what you see is the gray color. Down here in the kind of yellow color and orange color, that's all rural and agricultural of some variety, most of which is the rural and agricultural 5, which means 5 nominal acre lot size minimums. The light blue you see is another residential zone. We have the rural and estate zone with 2 acre minimums. And the OR you see, the outdoor rec you see in the corner, that's the Goldstream public use area that's owned by the state of Alaska. Our comprehensive plan calls for this to be outskirt area. And kind of the loose definition of that, we just defined it in our comp plan as generally areas within 20 to 30 minute commute of the urbanized area. And it really emphasizes variable residential development and density, as well as other agricultural type uses. I think it is very important to mention that this property was approved by this body in 2016 for land sale. With that, there was a bit of conversation about a replat as well as a potential rezone. A replat was approved by the plating board. A replat and a subdivision was approved by the plating board in 2017, and the rezone will be before you next week. All of the lots will meet the minimum lot size in the rural and agricultural 5 zone. Lot sizes ranging from 4.6 acres to 10.4 acres. So you can see the 4 lots on the north side of Goldstream Road, and then the 1 large lot on the south side of Goldstream Road. And it's expected that these lots will be for sale, for public sale this spring. Currently, again, they're vacant. About half of the property is estimated to be in wetland, and it does have a soil type that is typically a less developable soil type. With that said, there's 2 criteria that rezones are evaluated under Title 18. The first of which is it conforms to the comprehensive plan. I've already spoken about the outskirt area designation, and I'm going to just point out one specific strategy in the comp plan. It's Goal 4, Strategy 10, to rezone new subdivisions to appropriate land use designation concurrent with the platting process. And we feel that that is the case in this circumstance. We also feel that the proposed rezone conforms to public health, safety, and welfare, really because of the large lot size, those 5 nominal acre minimums, establishing setbacks in RA, which are not established in the general use zone, and then mostly just the use limitation. There's a very wide variety of uses that are allowed in general use and a much more restricted variety in the rural and agricultural zone, paring off most of the commercial and industrial type uses. The Planning Commission held a public hearing on July 24th and unanimously recommended approval to this body with 11 findings of fact, which are available on page 11 of your meeting packet. Community Planning sent out 57 Deer property owners just for this particular rezone, this small rezone. We didn't receive any replies back to that, and we had one person testify at the meeting. But with that said, there is a larger project in the works. As you can see on the map right here, the borough owns over 2,600 acres in the general area, And we've had what the mayor referred to, we've had 2 very well-attended community meetings out in the area to talk about the plan for the 2,600 acres and potential rezones for that. And at the first meeting, really one emphasis of the community was just what we're talking about tonight, getting the small portion, the 33 acres, into an appropriate zone before that goes into private ownership, and then we can kind of continue to work through the remaining 2,600 acres as time allows. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions the Assembly may have.
All right. Questions? I realize this isn't the most controversial ordinance before us tonight.
I got a question.
Yeah, Mr. Lejeski.
Would it be possible for us to put covenants on pieces of land like this before we sold them off? Like
That-
covenants that say you can't use a wood burning stove without an ESP? I don't know.
Like plat notes?
It's probably not a rezone question, but yeah, you could. I mean, we could put deed restrictions or something on the, yeah, we could do that.
Okay, I was just wondering.
Mr. Cooper.
Do you have a timeline for tackling the remaining acreage in the area? Or
It would be mostly speculation at this point. We've had 2 very, very well-intended community meetings. We had a charrette-type exercise at one of them. The community's been kind of very thankful. I'd estimate anywhere between, approximately 8 months, but that's just kind of a guess at this point.
and it's good to hear that you've had some community discussions, because I've heard from community members in that area concern about what the borough's intent is with that additional land up there, so.
Mr. Tackey.
Do you guys already have, you're intending to sell this, correct, after we rezone it? Is there already parties that seem interested in purchasing it after it's rezoned?
I really can't speak to that. That would be more of a land management question, and Ms. Mota will be here at the public hearing next week.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Further questions? So this 2,600 acres, which is a lot, access to all of that is going to have to come from Goldstream Road, right?
Not necessarily. There's a couple other potential access points, Monteverde in kind of the Moose Mountain area, and it's even been floated the idea of access off of Old Murphy Dome Road, but all that is kind of really, really speculation, and a lot of that would have to do with any potential subdivisions. And at this time, it's my understanding there's no planned development in the area from the borough's point of view.
All right. Any further questions? All right. Well, thanks for sticking around. Next ordinance. Ordinance number 2018-29, an ordinance amending the dates set forth in ordinance 2018-16 for the sale of real property acquired through property tax foreclosure and waiving the notice requirements in Fairbanks North Star Borough Code 8, Title 8, Chapter 24060E. The sponsor is Mayor Castle. There is additional information in the yellow, or in the green folder. Mayor Castle, may we have a staff report?
We do. We have half the finance department here for you and treasury budget, and I guess Debbie Brady will kick us off.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Assembly members. Almost morning. As you're aware, the Juanita Helms Administration Center was unexpectedly closed for most of the business day on August 24th, which prevented former record owners from repurchasing tax foreclosed properties and prospective buyers from submitting sealed bids. These events required a special assembly meeting on August 24th, where the assembly postponed the tax foreclosure ordinance, or the tax foreclosure sale, to a date to be set by future ordinance. The ordinance before you is that future ordinance. This ordinance, number 2018-29, amends the dates related to the sale of tax foreclosed property as established in ordinance number 2018-16, which you adopted in June. The administration intends to get back on track and move forward with the 2018 tax foreclosure sale as quickly as possible. Therefore, we are requesting immediate reconsideration on this ordinance during its public hearing next week. This ordinance sets the new deadline for acceptance of repurchase payments and sealed bids to be Monday, September 24th at 5:00 p.m. Successful bidders will be announced by 5:00 p.m. on Tuesday, September 25th, with postings on the borough's website and at the Juanita Helms Administration Center. Upon posting, Treasury and Budget Division staff will immediately begin calling successful bidders to make appointments for sale closings. In normal years, a successful bidder has 3 business days to make full payment and close on the sale. Due to the inconvenience of rescheduling, we have added a bit more time in this ordinance. Under the new schedule, a successful bidder will have until close of business on Monday, October 1st to make full payment. For your information and reference, your yellow folder should contain a handout of the calendar that will be used to implement this ordinance and outlines some of those dates that I've already mentioned. As stated in the cover memo for this ordinance, no outcry auction will be held for properties not sold through the sealed bid process. History shows that outcry auction sales have been small in number and are relatively expensive. The delay in this year's tax foreclosure sale has enabled some former record owners to repurchase tax foreclosed property in this intervening period. Tax foreclosure staff have also been in touch with additional former record owners who have indicated their intention to repurchase property prior to the new sale date. So here with me tonight are Peggy McDonald, the Treasury Budget Manager, Donna Brooks, the Assistant Treasury and Budget Manager and Supervisor for Tax Foreclosure, and Nicole Nordstrand, our Tax Foreclosure Specialist. I'll vacate the area so Peggy can be here, and these guys know lots of specific, and Nicole will continue and give you some stats so you know some of the numbers that we're dealing with.
Thank you, Debbie. Good evening. I'm Nicole Nordstrand, and I'll keep mine short. As Debbie mentioned, and you'll recall, the ordinance, or the adoption of Ordinance 2018-16 back in June, authorized the sale of 55 properties that the borough had taken tax deed to on May 29th. Since that time, 33 properties have been repurchased, leaving 22 properties, and then we also have 22 prior year properties that will be available to prospective bidders for sealed bids. And that's all I have to report. I'm happy to answer any specific questions you may have.
All right, does that conclude the staff report?
Yes, it does.
All right, actually, committee, questions? All right, I guess I've got a question, primarily for the attorney. Are we sure that these adjustments and dates are consistent with borough code as far as how these sales are supposed to occur?
Yes, we looked at state law and borough code to see what we had to move and what needed to be renoticed, and this is compliant with that.
All right. Because, I mean, you know as well as I that courts don't like foreclosed, they will tend to rule against the validity of these sales if they're given any reason to, if it is litigated.
Right, so we are giving people more time, not less, to repurchase their property, so I think there's less risk for that reason. And my understanding is they're going to publish 2 more times, is that right, or 3? 3 more times in the paper, so there's much more notice than there otherwise would have been.
All right. How many properties have been redeemed since the original August 24th or 25th date?
3 properties have been repurchased since the postponement.
Okay. All right, further questions? All right, thank you. Appreciate you sticking around. Okay, briefings from the Borough Mayor.
I'm glad to be back. I was out for a little bit, and it's nice to be back, other than I literally had over 1,200 emails to catch up on. And thank goodness I've got a wonderful staff in the mayor's office who took care of a number of those for me just before I got back. So anyway, glad to be here, and I don't have any other comments to make right now. Thank you.
Okay, comments from the committee members. I will start with Mr. Roberts.
No comment?
Mr. Coogan.
None.
Dodge.
No comment.
Mr. Tackey.
No comment.
Mr. Lejeski. Okay, well, I certainly can take a hint. So I have no comment. As far as assembly business, we have that capital projects and legislative priorities committee meeting tomorrow. Yeah, still tomorrow at 11 a.m. in the Jasmine Conference Room. And you don't have to be on that committee to attend that meeting. Next Thursday, we have a regular assembly meeting commencing at 6 o'clock, and that's all we got. At least, so we're going to be doing better next week than we are now.
Say that now.
Yeah, well, at least we won't have 2 work sessions after that assembly meeting, so that's an improvement. Tuesday, October 2nd, is the municipal election day for the borough and the cities, and in-person absentee voting at all 3 clerks' offices will occur between 8 and 5 p.m. beginning this Monday. All right, anything else for the good of the order?
Don't forget RSAC on Monday at 6 o'clock here.
All right, we are adjourned.